meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So we're starting now. Is that right? Is everyone in the room? Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on the new migration figures and what they mean for immigration policy and for politics. I'm Heather Rolfe. I'm Senior Research Fellow at British Future. So many of you will have seen the stats today, and as you would have seen, net migration has fallen substantially or fell substantially in the year to June 2025, driven by large reductions in work and study visas. So in political circles, the government will be seen to achieve some success in its goal to reduce migration. But will that be reflected in the government's own popularity ratings? Perhaps not. And at the same time, the changes may be seen as less good news for employers and universities, where there have been the biggest reductions. So we'll be talking about these trade-offs, and we'll be looking at the stats, what they mean, and we'll also be looking at the findings of the latest immigration attitudes tracker, which is out today. So we have a brilliant panel of speakers, with each with their own expertise on immigration. We're very pleased indeed to have Alan Manning with us. And as you know, he's the former chair of the Migration Advisory Committee and a professor at LSE. What you may not know is he has a new book, which is actually out today, and it's called Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Make It Better. We have Marley Morris, very pleased to have Marley with us today. He's Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities at IPPR. So Marley's worked on immigration for many years, I don't know how many, and he's published and spoken very widely on the topic, including on migration for work and migration policy generally. And last but not least, we have Sunder Katwala, who's Director of British Future and will be a very familiar face to many of you. So our panelists are first of all going to reflect on today's migration figures, and Sunder will then summarise the findings of the immigration attitudes tracker. And then I'll ask Alan and Marley for their take on the statistics and the survey findings and what it all means. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground. And the panelists, then importantly, we want to take questions from you. We want your questions to the panelists. So please, can you put them in the chat? Start putting them in now. And I should also remind you, as you probably heard at the beginning, the session is being recorded. So that's enough from me. So over to the first session of the webinar. So Alan and Marley, I'd like your 3-minute take on the new ONS figures and what headline story they tell. Are they broadly in line with what we were expecting? Were there any surprises? And how important are the figures for the government, for the public and politics? So Alan, would you like to go first on your 3 minutes?
Yes, so I think the top headline is, as you've already said, Heather, is net migration down, to now only a bit over 200,000. And within that, the managed part of net migration, is down, work, family, and students. But the less managed part, asylum claims, are actually up. And so in terms of, what this means for the government, you can sort of think that in some sense getting the overall numbers down is probably they'd hope would be good for them. But because people do worry about numbers, I believe, but they also worry quite a lot about asylum and things. And so that is going to be less good news for the government. And they've obviously proposed policy changes in that area, but it remains to be seen what effect they'll have.
Good, thank you very much. So basically good news, except that asylum is going up and that's going to be a public concern, you feel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Marley, how about you? What's your brief take on the figures?
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I broadly agree with Alan. I think the numbers have gone down very sharply, and I think that was expected. But still, I think because we saw the the revisions last week to the overall migration figures combined with the reduction, now we are getting into quite significantly lower numbers than we've seen recently. This is getting back into the kind of the era, sort of pre-Brexit era of in between 200 and 300,000, only just over 200,000 actually. And in fact, I think given the government's plans are to make further restrictions on migration, we could see further falls. We could even see numbers going actually below 100,000, the kind of the old net migration target from David Cameron's government, because most of these changes are a result of the previous government, given the new changes put in by the Labour government only came into effect at the earliest in July this year, and many of them haven't even been fully decided yet. So I think we can expect further reductions to come, at least on the kind of managed migration side, as Alan said. I think it's worth making a brief point about the link between the kind of managed side, the migration side, and the asylum piece as well. It looks like from the face of it that the record high in asylum applications is driven by, on the one hand, of course, the rise in small boat crossings that we've seen, but also quite large numbers of people applying from work and study visas. And I think that's a result of people coming on, the kind of very high numbers coming in recent years, since the pandemic and since the new immigration system post-Brexit. So it might be that people are struggling to find other ways to stay and so are now applying for asylum. If we see further tightening up the new settlement rules, what you could see actually is people looking for other ways to stay in the UK and actually applying for asylum as a result. So I do think there's a link to some extent between some of the restrictions we're seeing now on migration, following a very large rise post-pandemic, and then this sort of now this increase in asylum applications from people on study and work visas who have coming to the end of their visas, are now looking around thinking about other ways they can stay in the UK.
Yeah, interesting. I think, Alan, don't you cover this in your book about the lack of, I know that you question the need for a low-skilled route, but do some of these changes result from the closing off of low-skilled routes, other ways in which people can come to the UK?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think we're getting more asylum claims from these routes just because we've had high immigration into those routes in previous years. And so a certain fraction of them claim asylum as a result. So as those immigration numbers come down in those categories, I think there will be fewer, we might see fewer asylum claims in the future. But I think, if you say, should we design our lower skilled work migration routes with one eye on the asylum system, I would say that I don't think that would actually be a very good idea.
So I can see the picture is quite interesting. So it seems to be a sort of gradual reduction, chipping away at the visas rather than a big step change. Do you think that is the case in terms of the current statistics? They seem very, very low, but are they a culmination rather than suddenly things have changed?
I mean, I think my personal view that on the managed parts of migration, we're sort of more or less where we should be right now. We shouldn't actually see that much more in the way of restrictions or liberalizations. It's not that absolutely everything they've done in the work, family and students is what I personally would do, but I think we're more or less where we are, and we should let things settle for a while. What we do not want to get back into is the boom bust cycle, which would be, now numbers are really low, it's time to liberalize again, and that then leads to a sort of a big rise again, and then so we'd expect to see actually net migration bounce back a little bit, as the OBR showed, because most emigration is actually previous immigrants from a few years ago leaving the country again. So we're seeing a lot of emigration in these statistics, in part because we had high immigration a few years ago. In a few years' time, emigration will begin to fall because currently we've got much lower immigration.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's often left out of the picture, isn't it? The fact that more people sometimes leave than at other times. It's a changing picture. Sunder, do you want to give your take first of all on the immigration statistics, and then we'll segue into your presentation on the tracker findings?
Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Alan and Marley, for doing this. I'll go straight into the presentation because they're about the findings. They're about the figures as well, and I can illuminate them that way. So the slides are about to pop up. I think Priyesh is operating them remotely, and so this is just this is the British Future decade-long attitudes tracker, and so I'm giving you field work from July 2025. So quite a lot has happened since July, but that's when we asked these questions that we've asked, every year across the last decade. And our study is called Noise and Nuance. And the first slide that you'll see next is that most people are surprised by today's news. We asked two things. We told them that the net migration figures had last been announced in May, and we asked people, was 2024 lower, higher, or about the same as 2023? And big prize to the 14% of people who thought that 2024 net migration had been lower than it had been. That was a fall from 800 to 400 was what we thought at the time before the revisions. But net migration had halved, and we can see 56% of people thought it had gone up, and 70% of people didn't think it had fallen. Quite a lot of people don't know. It's quite a technical question. And then the other question, we'll have the next slide as well. We asked people is what next? What about next year? And very similar, 16% of people thought it would be lower. So we've seen today that 2025 is a lot lower than 2024. And again, a sixth of people have got some expectation that that's happened. So the big story here is that lots of people know about the record levels of immigration, and relatively few people know about the fall that has followed the surge. It might be a lag effect in what we're talking about. It might be the effects of media and political debates. It might be that as lower numbers happen, people get used to them. A couple of observations about this. This is a widely shared perception across the public. Liberals, balancers, as we call them, in the middle, people with tough views, they've all got this wrong, including the people who like immigration most. The more skeptical you are, the more likely you are to not be aware or to not give answers about the fall. And we did then tell people the answer and ask people what they thought was going on, and most people gave us answers, from the choices that most people gave us answers like work visas have fallen, student visas have fallen. About a fifth of people said, I don't believe that did happen, which again was higher with the people with the toughest views. But that isn't what most people think. So this isn't just confirmation bias. This is the fact that people are not hearing about this yet, partly because it's new. It's hard, of course, to notice a fall in the flow of immigration, though a sixth of the population was born abroad. You can see that there's migration where you live. You can see there's ethnic diversity. That's more visible than migration. You wouldn't be able to see whether the net flow was 400,000 or 200,000 by observing where you live. You'd be reliant on the debate we're having in politics and the media. So I think we can say the politics and media debate hasn't yet caught up for people who aren't paying a lot of attention to sort of Radio 4 programs or something like that. But people aren't naturally picking this up. They think it's stayed very high. Next slide. What do people want? Well, they'd like lower immigration. We've just that they don't know they've got it yet. So that is a tricky point. This particular finding, should numbers be reduced, increased, or stay the same, it's never tracked immigration levels particularly sharply. Salience tracks immigration levels more. So this might just be a I'm happy, I'm not happy finding. But we've got just over half the public would like lower numbers, but that's very politically polarized. It's not it's about just under half the Labour voters, the Liberal Democrat voters, the SNP voters, small number of Green voters. It's a very strong view of the right of centre voters, both Conservative and Reform, they would like larger reductions in immigration. So there's a numbers matter on the right and a bit more of a balance of view in the centre on the left when we're just talking about overall numbers. And the next slide, we dig into that a little bit. Interestingly, when did reduce hit the lowest level? It was 42% reduced, above half now. It hit the lowest level in 2022, which is when the actual net migration was at its very, very highest. So that might have been a lag effect that people thought there was some control after Brexit and didn't know about the high numbers they got, and that's come through. It's also doubtlessly about people's views about asylum as well, which people overestimate in our survey. They think it's about a third of immigration. It's going up as a share of immigration. It's an eighth of immigration now that immigration has fallen. So there are different things going on, but this preference for numbers isn't massively sensitive to changes in numbers, as you can see, partly because people aren't yet aware of changes in numbers, but for other reasons too. The next slide. If we were going to reduce immigration, what would we reduce? And then people are very skeptical about how much we could or should reduce named areas of migration, jobs, very popular jobs like doctors and nurses, necessary low-paid jobs like fruit pickers, and so on. Bankers get the worst score, but there still isn't, there still isn't a majority for reducing bankers' visas, and people might let them in if they paid their taxes or something like that. But you can see it's not related to income as such as perceived desirability and contribution. So there we see the dilemmas of control. Some people are sincere reducers. I would say a quarter to a third of the public are saying, I'd like it down a lot. And yes, I'll cut students and I'll cut other things. And more people are controllers rather than reducers. And this is also about how much are people thinking about visas, how much are people thinking about asylum, would explain why people might be reluctant to make reductions, even if they think the numbers could come down a bit. And the next one. Settlement and citizenship. Caveat here, people don't know a lot about this. People probably don't know what settlement is as opposed to citizenship. They know what citizenship is, and we asked we've asked this before. British Social Attitudes have asked before what roughly is the timeline, and 5 or 6 years is 10 to the 6 years we've got. 5 years settlement, a year for citizenship is median public opinion. But because the government was talking about earned contribution and was talking about tiers, we thought we'd find out about that. And what we found is that differentiation makes some sense to the public. People are for 5 years for graduate level qualifications, and they're between 5 and 10 years for other qualifications. We've got some people in Never. Reform wish to abolish indefinite leave to remain. It's quite a niche view. So the public agree on this tiered approach intuitively when they're asked this question. As I say, probably haven't given it a lot of thought before they were asked this question, but they're not quite as extravagant as the government in saying 10, 15, 20, 30 years for some groups. The public are varying between 5 and 10. 5 and 10 years are broadly the range of timelines that there are in other advanced democracies, and there hasn't yet been this policy of differentiation. So the government's new proposals are deliberately putting the longest timelines you've ever heard of on some forms of immigration. They're tougher than where the public are. Now, we also get some polarisation under this. I would say the Labour government's proposals are quite a good deal tougher than the people who vote Labour and the people who vote Liberal Democrat, who are more towards the 5 years, 5 to 10 years. The government's proposals are somewhat closer to the voters of the right, who have tougher views about this. The parties of the right are a good deal to the right of the voters of the right. So basically, our elites have got tougher views than the public. They might hold those sincerely and think we should have longer timelines. They're probably doing it because they think that's what the public want, and the public are a little bit more balancer about rules, obligations, timelines, but also wanting it to happen because it's fair or because it's good for cohesion and integration. And is that the rest of the slides? Yes. Look, there's loads more in the report. There's about 70 odd pages, and we dig into all of the politics, who trusts who, and so on. One thing I'd say is that public trust has been very, very low in politicians. It's partly because people have made quite extravagant promises, not kept them. Maybe they've made promises they can't keep. We've got a unique twist for the Starmer government, because if people knew about the falls in overall levels, they'd be very surprised and they'd have exceeded expectations as a government. But if people don't know, you don't change the politics. So I think we're seeing some hardening of views at the very tough end. And most people are still balancers, but we're seeing a vocal mobilization of the people who aren't. We're seeing some polarization of politics. So it's choppy out there. But our main observation is that if you get underneath the noise, there's still quite a lot of nuance, but not perhaps from the loudest people in the debate, especially on the rejectionist and restrictionist side, but sometimes on the liberal side too. Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Sunder. I mean, we're always interested in people's perceptions about immigration and the numbers. And so it wasn't a surprise in the survey, I think, that we found that when they were told, as Sunder said, when people were told that numbers had fallen since 2023, 21% said they didn't believe that they had. And I think that for reform voters, it was more like it was 30-something percent, upper 30%. So Sonda, you said, oh, well, you know, the press hasn't got through to them, or maybe, you know, political announcements haven't got through to them. Do you think it's something else, though? Do you think also people believe that that they kind of hear the stats and they think, actually, that's not true? I think that people are coming, way more people are here unregulated, overstaying visas and that kind of thing. So do you think there's a lack of trust in the immigration system as well as those messages not getting through?
I think it varies. So I think there's I mean, we've got a kind of quarter in our very tough group. About 16% of people are broadly quite rejectionist of immigration, is in that they'd like shut the borders or as little as possible. And we're asking people to give us a score of 0 to 10. The number giving 0 is 16% now, and it was 8% a few years ago. So we're converging. So that's that mobilization. People who've got that view tend to think that everyone else has that view, and they tend to be very mistrustful of major political parties, you know, broadcasters, the media, and so on. So that's a tough view. It's not the majority view. And you know, there are people who say, well, you know, I don't know if I know that much about it. You know, thank you for the information, as well as I don't believe you. But if people are thinking boats and asylum, then they are able to obviously challenge claims about statistics on the grounds of, well, they're the ones you counted, haven't you? Now, most people who come irregularly do claim asylum, so we do count them in the end. In that, obviously, the government is estimating overstayers, and you know, academics have to work out how to estimate overstayers. So you obviously don't know some things. The public know you don't know things. So again, it's a balance then as to how worried are you about the scale of the lack of control. How worried are you that people don't tell you the truth? But what I would say, politicians and the media have got different jobs. I think there's a challenge here for the broadcasters. If only a sixth of people know it, and the people with quite liberal and quite moderate and quite balanced views, and the people with moderately tough views don't think it as well as the people who never trust the broadcasters. So I think the BBC does a very, very good job on days like today, when the numbers come out and they show you all the charts. But what the BBC's migration review said, which I think was an important finding, was if you're always reporting what is there a political argument about, then you will always over-report the things that are argued about politically, which probably will be asylum. And you will tend to under-report whether it's going up a lot, whether it's coming down a lot, other things where it's a social impact, what's going on with universities, what's going on with the care sector, what's going on in skilled work, what's going on in low skilled work. If those aren't politically contested, they don't get looked at. So, you know, a useful thing I think broadcasters would be able to do is just remember to take 15 seconds to put it in context. People really value that. And then the politicians have got different motives as to who they're trying to appeal to. But there's a particular challenge, I think, to this government, that it's sending very strongly asylum isn't in a grip, we get it, we'll get a grip, whatever we think of the proposals. And that chimes with people. But they're also sending immigration numbers are out of control message quite strongly. And I don't think if you had half an ear on the radio news, you would expect to pick up from the government. They've got it. You know, the numbers are being managed down. They happen to be the policies they've inherited. So the government might need to think a bit more now about how it can communicate a new phase of the debate, because we're currently having the debate of the last parliament rather than perhaps the debate of this parliament.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. So, Alan, over to you on responses to Sunder's presentation and what we've discussed so far. So, anything that stands out for you from the tracker findings that Sunder mentions, anything that particularly chimes with some of the key points in your book?
Yes, no, thank you for mentioning my book. I've got a copy here, so I will shamelessly mention it at every opportunity, probably. So I think that one thing that Sunder comes out is the challenge of getting people to know what actually is happening. And I think one of the reasons that happens is that the way in which we discuss migration policy, I argue in the book, as the title suggests, immigration policy is hard. But I also say that we make it much harder than it needs to be by having a very binary, polarized debate in which people divide into two camps, either pro or anti-immigration, and then that becomes very polarized. Either immigration is very good or immigration is very bad. And I think that way of framing immigration makes about as much sense as asking, like, is food good for us? The answer to that question is food is good for us up to a point, but we can probably have too much food as well. And we should be discussing at what point, how much food should we have, really? And that's not the way we discuss immigration. And you can see that in the media reactions to the figures today. If you go to the sort of anti-immigration sort of newspapers that we think generally are hostile to it, you will see them not really mentioning the big headline falls in net migration, or it's sort of down in the article. They were up the front will be talking about increases in asylum claims and more people in asylum hotels, a little bit more, and so on. On the other hand, if you go to the more sort of liberal things, you will see people mentioning the big fall in net migration, not really mentioning quite so much the increase in asylum claims. And I think, so one of the challenges is actually to get people out of their echo chambers and actually understanding, really getting a rounded picture of what's going on. I mean, I would say on the, this sort of not quite misrepresenting the scale of what's going on happens on both sides. So there are people who we talk too much about small boats. We talk too much about asylum. But on the other hand, there are people who I think are trivializing the scale of the problem. As Sunder says, the numbers are going up in absolute terms as a share of total. Currently, I think the latest statistics, 25% of those getting settlement who settle long term are coming through a refugee kind of route. It's not the 5% that other people, some people are sort of talking about. And I think it would be very dangerous to repeat the mistakes that Joe Biden made in the US, which was on sort of unmanaged migration at the US southern border for years and years, to say, oh, there's nothing really going on here, nothing much to see here. And numbers kept on rising and rising. And eventually he did take some action. But it was by then too late, basically, and had, reductions at the end of his term. And that contributed to the election of Donald Trump. And I think Shabana Mahmood is right to say we need to be thinking about asylum at the moment as a serious issue. Numbers may not be so high right now, but they are rising. I mean, if you want to know about Biden, I think Sunder has got a very good piece with Frank Sherry, which sort of gives you a sort of brief description of that. I don't know if I've summarized the conclusion of that will be reasonably accurately.
Yeah, so for you, I mean, obviously quite a lot of your book is about different types of migration, including migration for work, because obviously you were chair of the MAC. Do you think that's going to become a much less controversial issue? Or do you think it could become, there could be more temporary routes because of the change to settlements, and the type of work migration could change in some respects? Or do you think really the debate is going to be dominated by asylum in the coming couple of years, say?
I mean, I think on work, I think there's a place for sort of temporary migration, but only where the migration is naturally temporary. Seasonal agricultural work, one example, students coming to the end of their studies, another. Where it's artificial, I think if you start off with temporary migration, it tends to evolve into something much more permanent. I mean, I'm generally of the view that visas with paths to settlement don't work well in jobs where the main reason that employers want migrants is because of poor paying conditions. And in the UK, the best example of that is social care. So although, having a social care visa is popular, as you know, Sunder says. I think that, again, I would say comes from not really understanding how the social care visa works. It isn't actually a very effective long-term visa in resolving the very serious problems of recruitment and retention in social care. Because when people get settlement on that route, they're very likely to quit for exactly the same reason that Brits don't want to work particularly in that sector. They're better options elsewhere. So I mean, I think work where we are at the moment is more or less okay, and so as things are okay, they tend to go down the agenda. I think asylum migration is going to remain up, basically.
Do you not think that the changes on leave to remain will effectively result in more temporary migration?
I think the changes actually for work family are actually much less dramatic than both the supporters and the opponents have said. So although the headline is, 10 years, they've said, well, actually, NHS workers going to get 5 years, family of British citizens 5 years, anybody earning above a certain amount, and given the current restrictions on new people coming in on skilled worker visas, that would be 5 years as well. The big groups that would be affected by the changes are, first of all, the asylum and refugees, particularly those who came on unauthorized routes, where they are proposing to make it much harder to obtain settlement. And secondly, the group, and the biggest single group, is again care workers who came under under the visa that was open for a few years that Boris Johnson opened. And I think the government is in a very difficult position on that, because if you give ILR as planned to those workers, two things happen. Firstly, they have the rights to work anywhere, so they may well see a crisis of quits in the social care sector, which will precipitate, a different sort of crisis. And the second change is that those people get access to welfare benefits. So if they remain working in social care, where they're likely to be earning really minimum wage, there's potentially quite a large welfare benefit bill that comes from that. So I'm afraid, I think these are my view is the social care visa was a very short-sighted policy. The long-term risks crystallize when those workers get settlement, and the government it's very hard to know what the right thing to do is. In fact, that's the title of my book, Immigration Policy is Hard. So I think we wouldn't have been in this position if we hadn't had the social care visa. And where we are, we've got unattractive and unpalatable policy options in front of us, really.
Yeah, no, you make a strong case for that. So you say immigration policy is hard. Do you think the government's been this is the last question, actually, by the way, before I move on to Marley. So do you think that the government is makes it harder by having very complex policies? So the leave to remain thing, as you've just said, there's going to be all these, there's going to be different lengths of time, there's going to be all these exceptions, things that can accelerate, things that reduce it. And to me, it's a bit like the budget. So many different changes, very very difficult to find out actually what the changes are. So in terms of expecting the public to understand and get behind the changes, do you think just the sheer complexity of some of the legislation, the proposals is against them?
I mean, I think there's no chance for the public to understand all of the nuance of the proposed changes to ILR, and we wouldn't expect them to. I mean, I think I think the complexity in visa design. I mean, I think a big fault in visa design, I think, has been not to do sort of due diligence on what could go wrong with a visa. Typically, people propose a visa to do something, and they don't take account of the way in which it might actually be used in practice. But those are mistakes that not really the public are making. I think those are the mistakes that politicians have been making, or the advice they've been getting on visa design. So one of the ways I argue in the book we can make migration policy better is just to have better visa design, just to ask all the time when you're proposing a visa, what can go wrong and what can we do to mitigate that in advance? And it's just incredible that routinely has not been done in the past.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Thank you. So Marley, so employers, I said at the beginning, employers and universities might not be celebrating today. What do the figures mean for them? What do the figures also mean for economic growth? Because we're obviously hearing a lot about that, and yesterday in the context of the budget. So what will their take be on the stats?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the government has set out, I think you could describe as sort of three-prong approach to migration. There's, on the one hand, sort of control, trying to bring the numbers down. Other part is the composition, so trying to shift towards a higher skilled migration system. And then this idea of contribution, which is discussed in the earned settlement reforms. Clearly, control is working when it comes to the sort of managed part of the immigration system, which is perhaps as you'd expect because the government has much stronger levers in this area, and numbers are have gone down quite substantially, as we were saying. That obviously has an impact on GDP just because of the number of people in the country. Albeit a much smaller impact on GDP per capita. It also has a fiscal impact. I think the estimate is roughly about sort of £7 billion in terms of public borrowing for every reduction of net migration of around 100,000. So there are sort of important economic and fiscal considerations for any big changes in migration policy, and there are these really difficult trade-offs as well. Obviously, we see the relationship, for instance, between migration policy and higher education. One example being the budget yesterday, this announcement of a new international student levy, which is designed in a way so that every student beyond a certain threshold, there'll be a charge of £925 per year for the university. Now, there's an argument which is set out in the Home Office white paper for why you want to do that, and of course there are the supporting young people in terms of skills and employment using that money. There's a strong case for, but there's also clearly a significant risk for the higher education sector, which is highly reliant on international students, and it is one of our key exports as well. So if you're thinking about it from a growth strategy, it's quite an unusual move for a government to tax its own exports. So there are these really difficult trade-offs. As I said, one of the elements of the government's policy is around trying to shift towards a more higher skilled model, and I think that's partly it's kind of a way of trying to navigate the challenges with the OBR by saying, well, actually, look, we're going to reduce aspects of migration that are lower paid, lower skilled. That's going to have less of an impact on productivity, have less of an impact on the overall fiscal picture, because we're going to also at the same time trying to encourage higher skilled, higher paid migration through reforms such as through the global talent visa, the high potential individual route, and so on. I think it remains to be seen whether that balance can be struck. One of the key questions will be, and this links to the kind of question of temporariness, is the temporary shortage list, which is now being proposed by government. And this is where I slightly probably disagree with Alan, that I think although the work migration system might seem to be working reasonably at the moment, the government has introduced a number of reforms. So it's still very much in flux for a lot of employers. I think employers don't quite know what to expect because we still have this big review being going on from the Migration Advisory Committee on what the shape of this temporary shortage list will look like. This will affect medium skilled jobs, but it will have a big impact for some employers because whether those jobs are on that list or not will depend on will affect whether they can recruit using the skilled worker visa at all into those jobs. So it's going to be important. The government have explicitly linked the temporary shortage list to the industrial strategy, which is quite interesting and marks a shift in approach from previous governments where there is this quite direct link between our industrial strategy, the 8 priority sectors, and our immigration system. But yeah, again, we don't know the full details. We don't know exactly what it will look like. We don't know, for instance, whether it will be a temporary route or whether there will be a pathway to permanent settlement. It's not entirely clear yet. So I think if for employers, there's probably still a huge number of open questions. We don't know how this list will work. We don't know how the earned settlement policy will work. The consultation just came out last week. And so quite big areas of immigration policy are still in flux. And as I said at the start, a lot of the changes that have already been introduced in July, we haven't seen the impact yet on net migration. So some big questions, I think, ahead for the economy on immigration policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Marley. So you raised the question there of also whether the system is sufficiently flexible. I mean, I know the idea of the immigration shortage list is for it to be flexible, but is it updated enough? I mean, so Alan, from your experience on the Mac, do you think that our system is able to respond so that we don't have a situation where employers can't recruit and when there's impacts not only on their sector but on regional growth and on other industries within their area?
I mean, I think the system does need to be responsive to where there are real shortages and bottlenecks in the system. But often I think the shortage argument has been overdone a lot. I mean, employers have found that it's an argument that sort of works with public opinion, and with the government. And so, they use it a lot, even in situations where I think it's not really, justified. So, for example, if a firm came along to us and said, well, nobody wants to buy my products, we'd probably go, well, your product's a bit rubbish, perhaps, or the price is too high. But if they come along and say, well, nobody wants my jobs, we don't turn around to them and say, well, perhaps your job is a bit rubbish, you should do more to make it better. Lots of people think, yeah, we should give you workers if you say you can't recruit on your current terms and conditions. So I'm probably less sympathetic to the shortage argument than many people. And I don't think where shortages is because of poor paying conditions, that is not where we should be using immigration. We should be using immigration where the shortage is because there's nobody in the country who is able to do a job, rather than there's nobody in the country who wants to do the job.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question that's just sent directly to me, but I would say to everyone else, please put your questions in the chat. So this question is that IPPR and British Future have called for an annual immigration plan, which would presumably help with some of this planning of where the visas should go. And so then the government could be held to account each year on its performance against that plan. So it said it's going to reduce in particular sectors, presumably. So does the panel think that this proposal would help address the gulf between the immigration we have and the immigration that public thinks we have? So Sandra, I know that you're a big fan of this idea, so if you want to go first, and then I think Marley's also a fan, so you can go second.
I mean, it's an attractive idea that you would have some kind of process. So all of the wonks, British Future and the IPPR, joined by the Institute of Government, but also the Centre for Policy Studies, who want to drive the numbers down. All of the wonks say we should do it, and most of the politicians say it when they were in opposition. Robert Jenrick is for it now. He didn't do it when he was in charge. Yvette Cooper actually advocated for it when she was the Home Affairs Select Committee person, but she chair when Jeremy Corbyn was the Labour leader, but she didn't do it when she was Home Secretary. So you can see there's a reluctance for the people holding the ball to do it. Do I really want to do that? And if you obviously look at why a budget is difficult, you can see why it's sort of challenging to give yourself more accountability. If you think about this government, it found it easy to say net migration is unsustainable when it was, numbers were almost 1 million and so on. And I think it's relatively easy for it to say it when numbers are 680,000, or so. That's 1% of the population. When it's 0.5% of the population, 350,000, the Brexit level, it's very hard in terms of the impact on housing to keep up with that. Even if you could manage everything else brilliantly, public services and integration and so on, that would be hard. But when you get down to these 200 levels, what this government hasn't said is, if you think that was unsustainable, what is sustainable? Should it always just be as low as you can go? Because then we can go to net 100, we can go to net 0, we can go to net emigration. Or is there a way of saying what is sustainable? I think this government doesn't want to give a number for good reasons and bad reasons. Its bad reason is, if you put something out, what if you miss it? Maybe we don't want to be accountable. Its good reason is it doesn't particularly believe in net migration as such, or it didn't overall. It sort of does believe in it for housing, but it doesn't believe in it generally. It believes in differences between different flows. Well, if that's the case, something like this should really help you, because you can turn up, be as nuanced as you want about the different flows, but give us something to hold you accountable to. At the moment, I think the current government is going to be held accountable to the last government's net migration target of tens of thousands, or the current opposition's idea of what the cap should be, or Nigel Farage's policy of net zero. But they've only got themselves to blame if they don't set their own framework. And at the moment, the government's message is it should be lower at 800, at 400. It was probably secretly aiming for about 200, and so on, but it didn't tell us what it was doing. And the other big benefit for government is, and this relates to some of the things Alan says in his book, there's always a good case for every specific change. But if you've made commitments to what the changes will add up to, then you need a mechanism. So Kemi Badenoch said something quite funny, I think. She said, well, when the statistics came out, we did make some changes. Well, they did that, they did that in sort of Q3 of year 13. But the statistics were coming out a lot. And I think they deliberately chose not to have this kind of mechanism because it would have made them sweat quite hard about what they'd said in the manifesto. But I think if you're going to put things in manifestos, I think you need to create the mechanisms that hold you to account for them.
Thank you. Marley, what do you think about the migration plan, annual migration plan?
Thanks. I haven't planted this question, by the way. It feels almost too convenient.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with Sunder. I think there are basically two main arguments for it. I think Sunder set out that there's a communications argument, and there's also a kind of accountability argument about here, what's the framework, how are we holding ourselves accountable. I think there's also a kind of there's an intergovernmental argument, which is you can use the plan as a way to try to navigate some of the tensions between different departments that I think is very that have proved tricky over successive governments now. Whether it's you've got Home Office and potentially Number 10 who are kind of on one side of a conversation, you want to bring down numbers, but you've got different interests in Department for Business and Trade, in DFE when it comes to international students, when it comes to Department for Health, when it comes to the NHS workers or care workers, and so you've got these tensions, and I think having a kind of plan and a process, a bit like with the budget for different departments to come together to work together in a coordinated way to set out a clear framework could help to try to navigate those tensions as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, Alan, what are your thoughts on immigration plan? I can't remember whether it appears in your book or not.
I must confess, it doesn't. It doesn't really. I'm not really against it. I'm not really hostile to it, but I'm not. I remain to be convinced it's going to be a pan. It's going to make things much better. I mean, I feel in this, I should put the opposite point of view here, but probably a bit stronger than I actually feel. I think we look at countries that do have this, so for example, Australia has something like this and Canada has something like this. I'm not sure that it actually makes a huge amount of difference to the way things are discussed. So a few years ago, Australia, a bit like we had under Boris Johnson, had numbers much higher than, the plan suggested. That became an enormous rod to beat them over the back with. I think this thing that I've already mentioned, this sort of reporting one set of statistics that are favorable to your position, ignoring the ones that are less favorable, probably in the plan, there'd be something that's looking good from the government's perspective, something that's not looking so good. You'd get this exactly the same. But I think, I don't really think that there are massive downsides from doing it either. So then the sort of bit of me says, well, perhaps we should just give it a go and see what happens.
You think there wouldn't be anything to lose?
Well, as long as nobody leaks it, an hour before, maybe that should be regarded as a sizable risk.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, Heather, can I come back in on that? Yeah, I think Alan's right that in a way it would have some similarities to what we do at the moment. I think sometimes we get the net migration figures as a moment when government might panic, like the week before, or the week after, and so I think if you had this, you might get some quite shallow politics around it by the government and by the opposition, but you'd also have created the timeline of when you wanted to do that, and it would be up to governments, as with tax and spending and budgets and so on, whether to do sort of gimmicky things or serious things and so on. So I don't think it resolves the fact that there are that there are politics. I think Canada and Australia, I think, are good examples of it, but they found it easy to do because historically they've been targeting growth of migration and population
Mm.
and wanting it to be quite selective. And it works quite well when you're doing that. And then how has it worked when they're cutting it? It puts them under that pressure of having to account for it. And so in a way it's harder to use, but it might have some useful sharpness. I think one thing we did see in both election campaigns is where opposition parties were saying things like, whatever the number is, it should be 100,000 lower. And governing parties were able to come back and say, well, is the backpacker visa going then? Or is that going? How does it add up? So while we don't have a perfect debate about taxation and spending either, people can make sort of silly claims from the left, from the middle, from the right on what they can afford and what they can't afford. You do have a bit more challenge in the public debate. And something like this, I think, familiarizes the idea, the sort of metaphor of a budget or spending review, that there are, the numbers come from somewhere and they come from good things you want and they're constrained if you don't want them. So I think it nudges in the direction of having to say it. Whereas at the moment it's quite easy to say, let's have a legal cap. I mean, the current opposition policy, the opposition has retracted its sort of deportation bill because people looked into what was in it. The current opposition policy is because they didn't hit their targets and they weren't trusted, there'll be a legal cap. And as soon as you hit it, you just stop handing out the visas. And in that form, it's an absolutely daft policy because, if you applied for student place, you wouldn't know if you could get the plane or not, or we might only have, a quarter of them and so on. So I think something that has more sensible pressures than what we've got at the moment, which is slogans, would be worth trying. It's not a panacea for politics, but it kind of structures the politics a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, from what you've all said, do you think it actually would make sense more in a situation where more migration was needed? So planning which sectors, what type of migration, and I just wonder whether any of you think we could be in that situation at some point, because we all seem to assume, we have been assuming, immigration is going to go up and up and up. We certainly did that with Eastern European migration, and that didn't happen. So do you think we could be in a situation where we're actually thinking about who do we need to attract? No one wants to answer.
Who
Do you want
do you
to
want to
answer
add?
that?
I mean, look, at the moment, it's a UK-wide policy. I think, the devolved administrations, they don't want to emulate the student levy policy, for example. The devolved administrations tend to say, don't forget that we need it as well. I think it's more likely, and I think there's a challenge here for the advocates of immigration in civic society and business and so on. I don't think it's massively sensible to respond to net migration of 200,000 by saying, why is it so terribly low? Can't we double it again, for the reason Alan said? But I do think it's reasonable to challenge. I think political elites, media elites have currently got a caricature of the public. And so having an auction to just say the lowest number without taking it seriously. I think when you get below the 200,000s, we should now take seriously the choices that you make. And they're also having a sort of deportations auction as well, which just doesn't fit where the public are at all. Once we get beyond, foreign criminals, there's obviously people deport people who aren't nationals and so on, and you get beyond, failed asylum seekers, had a fair process, and short-term things that end. There's a debate at the moment among the elite, which I think is based on an idea that the public, like if there was a big wave in, would like to ship a lot of it out, and we don't find any evidence for that. So I think the elite, the political class, tends to sort of, in a way, it's overcompensating. Sort of like there's a case made against the political class that it sort of didn't spot Brexit coming, it didn't spot Trump coming, so it should spot things like that. They're now almost projecting onto the public a set of views that the public don't have any sense of trade-offs, that we don't find is true of the general public, even if it might be true of some of the people who email MPs and are loudest on the internet.
Thank you. Marley, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I don't think that the sort of the net migration figure should be the sort of centerpiece of our kind of the way that we think about migration. It is one important consideration, but that's partly, again, the value of the annual migration plan is that you can look at, you can distinguish between different flows. You can have a
Mm,
clearer framework. I think that there are reasons why you should care about overall net migration in terms of population management, housing, but actually there are lots of considerations where you're thinking about things a lot more subtly. And again, from a business perspective, I don't think businesses are particularly worried about the overall level of net migration. I think that what they're interested in is how can they recruit people into particular jobs. What does the system look like? How easy is it to use? How much does it cost? Those are probably the bigger questions, rather than the overall numbers. And again, the government, I suppose, is trying to move to a system which has greater flexibility for kind of higher skilled migration, where you're opening up the global talent visa. You're making some changes there. You're making it easier for people who are more highly paid to settle in the UK. But you're placing tougher restrictions, and obviously we see, like, for instance, the default 15-year route for people
mm.
who are on jobs, who are sponsored for jobs below graduate level. So there are sort of distinctions being made there. Now, I think you can make arguments about exactly if that's the right approach, but I think it does point to the fact that I think the overall number is not necessarily the
Mm.
key point when it comes to thinking about impacts on the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, final question, because I know Alan has to go and teach very, very soon. So, Alan, you said at the beginning of the session, and in your book, actually underlined this, you say that we need a better way of talking about immigration and ditch the dichotomy of immigration good versus immigration bad that leads to noisy and opposing tribes and polarization. It could be written by British Future, that phrase. Anyway, it sounds great. And but how do we do it? So each of you could just say in a couple of minutes, how do we achieve that? Alan first.
Yes, no, well, thank you. I mean, part of what I wrote was, influenced by British Future. I think I used their idea of the balancers, which I think is actually very helpful and makes me optimistic that there is a way for immigration to become a less salient political issue, as it has been at various times in the past. It hasn't always been like this. I mean, I think we sort of just need to say, well, first of all, what does immigration really do? It just increases our population. So how fast do we want our population to grow? We don't want population decline. We don't want really fast population growth. We want something in the middle, I would suspect. I suspect. And then immigration changes the mix of the population. It changes the age. It changes the skill mix. Are those changes in the mix of the population? Are those the things that we want them? So to see things from those kind of angle. I think also we've kind of given, my view is that we've actually given too much power to lobbies, in particular employer and university lobbies, in designing immigration policy. And we need to step back against that. So, if you take the university levy, I'm sort of a bit ambivalent about that, but it remains the case there's no VAT on student fees, and international students don't pay council tax, so they're not actually paying for anyone to collect their bins at the moment. So that's quite a favourable position in the status quo that maybe the government is redressing a little bit, going a bit too far the other way. So I think there's too much, powers for lobbies. But finally, I think just to recognise it is going to be hard. It is not going to be easy, and there are no easy magic solutions to any of the problems. And sometimes pretending things are easy when they're not is what leads you to sort of magical thinking and actually making things worse, not better.
Yeah, thank you. Marley, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree a lot with that. And as I said, I think the annual migration plan does provide a way for the government to think through some of the trade-offs. I think the other thing that I would add is I think it's really important to have a kind of equal focus on integration and cohesion alongside migration. And if we were to propose a plan, I think that would be crucial to it. That is one of the concerns that I have about the settlement proposals, because as Sunder said, I think good way of putting it, sort of some of the figures involved are extravagant in terms of the length of time that people will have to wait to settle, and I think that has a potentially really damaging impact on integration. But I think I think there is. But I think there is, an opportunity here, and the government does recognise, I think, the importance of integration and cohesion. And I think there is an opportunity to think about integration in a much more concerted, thorough and nuanced way. And we haven't had a strategy on integration for many years now. Thinking about how that links up with cohesion, because of course you can just think about the net migration figures, but that's simply just, you know, people coming in and out of the country. It doesn't say anything about what people do while they're here, how people settle, how people meet each other, how people settle into communities and connect and find jobs and learn English and meet others. That's, you know, that part of it is completely missed if we just simply look at the kind of numbers of people coming in and out. So I do think that that's a crucial part of trying to of appealing actually to the balances in this debate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Excellent point. So Sunder, last word to you on this.
Yes, I think look, immigration attitudes lurch around quite a lot because people have different views of it. We did see quite a lot of softening because that idea you couldn't be heard, once we had the Brexit referendum, whatever you think about the result, was quite cathartic, but we also had new choices to make. I think we've had a hardening after that, largely, I think, because of the visibility of votes. So I think these lower numbers give an opportunity for sort of non-populist politicians, non-populist parties to try and make it a more normal, a more rational issue that works like other issues. That's why things like the plan, I think, give you a place to try and make people engage with the kinds of trade-offs that Alan is also talking about. I think the limits to that working are that it is a particularly emotional debate. So I think if there isn't a sort of more sense of control of asylum, then the immigration debates on all the other flows aren't really going to get the attention and so on. So in a way, the Home Secretary's right about that, but I'm not convinced about the policies she got. I'm not sure the analysis of why it's happening. So doing the things that will work on flows, and we've published our ideas. But the other thing that is emotional, it relates to what Marley just said, is the sort of how much confidence we have in integration and cohesion in a changing society. I think we're going to have quite a polarized debate about that because of the politics that we've got. So I think on the whole, we're looking at quite a potential for consensus about the kinds of policies that we want, but quite a lot of political clashes about who you trust and who you don't trust about it. We're not going to get entirely away from that, but I think understanding that's or how do people become us, what citizenship settlement work, not by making it take a very long time, but just visibly showing what you have to do and letting people see it is good for the emotional bits, and that probably goes alongside a kind of a more rational policy making focus for the bits that people probably think is important but quite boring on visa migration. So there's no one size fits all point, but I think the government should be aiming to diffuse the debate, and at the moment, in order to show they get it, they're putting heat and noise into the debate instead of looking for strategies to diffuse some of the heat and noise, including by getting a grip on things that don't look in control, but actually not sending the message that things are out of control where they're not.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, we are out of time. I think the best way to sum all of that up is that immigration is very hard, as Alan has said. It's also super interesting, and there's so much going on. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Marley, Sunder, and Alan, whose book is out today. And I would urge, where is it available so that people can buy it? Is it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon. Yes, you can find that there, and I'm not quite sure where else actually, but
all good bookshops.
That's what we say, but I'm not sure it's entirely true. And obviously, any bookshop that doesn't have it is not a good bookshop. But
can order it.
And presumably, you're going to be doing a speaking tour and that kind of thing.
A bit of things. You're giving me the opportunity to plug. I'm doing something with the Resolution Foundation more next week, actually, on the 4th. People can sign up for that if they want, either remotely or in person. A few other things, yeah.
Good. And I'll also plug our immigration tracker report, which is also out today. So big day for everyone. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of Migration Statistics Day.
Thank you. Bye.